European countries on the front line of the Mediterranean migrant crisis are pushing back against Brussels, saying a proposed new pact doesn't do enough to share the burden across all member states. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez hosted the leaders of Italy, Greece and Malta ahead of today's EU-hosted meeting of foreign ministers from the Mediterranean region. Brussels wants to increase returns of economic migrants and reinforce legal challenges for immigration. The frontline EU nations have issued a memorandum calling for greater solidarity from Europe and closer dialogue with the migrants' home countries. Well, let's find out a little bit more about today's meeting. Let's head to Brussels to speak to our correspondent, Shona Murray. Shona, those frontline countries that I just mentioned, what have they asked for? And does it look like we're actually going to see any sort of resolution this year?
That's right, Rosie. As you mentioned there, Italy, Spain, Greece and Malta, the four countries have really been on the front line of the refugee and migrant crisis for the past 5 years, taking refugees and migrants from Africa and of course, the Middle East. They've outlined their deep reservations with the practical nature of the Migration Pact. They say there isn't enough burden sharing for the rest of the EU member states and that they're really still on the front line. They also say that the pact itself could be counterproductive because of the border patrols and the processing elements in it, which means that you could end up with having huge detention centres all dotted across the EU's southern countries, like we saw in the island of Lesbos, for example. Now, within the pact, member states have an option to relocate refugees or to manage and finance expulsions of migrants who aren't legally entitled to be in the EU, that don't get refugee status. Or also member states can also give technical and practical support to countries that have a serious overburdening of refugees. The member states that I mentioned, they say this doesn't go far enough, and whether this issue will be resolved by the end of the year, unlikely. And I was speaking to EU sources over the past few days about the issue. The Migration Pact itself, as we know, was only published in September. It was due to be published in February, but because of the coronavirus, it was delayed. And it had been a priority for the German presidency of the EU, but that has actually fallen by the wayside. So it's very unlikely that there will be any sort of resolution anytime soon.
We've seen a sort of really east-west split over the budget, and now we have a north-south divide over migration. How significant is it, and do you think the EU can overcome it?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I think that the divide isn't because it's north-south per se. It's obviously because these countries are on the front line of the migration. If the migration situation was coming from other parts of the EU into the European Union, we'd have a different sort of scenario. It is a major fault line for Brussels, for Europe, and it has been for 5 years. But other issues have dominated, like Brexit, like the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's why we haven't heard about it as much. And the EU has also been able to say that it is working on the Migration Pact for the past few months, and now we have the pact, and it doesn't seem to satisfy those member states. Can the EU overcome it? It'll have to, but again, it appears we're kind of back to square one. Rosie?
Shona, thank you very much. Our correspondent there in Brussels.